Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm very honoured to be here this morning. I apologise for the voice. I rang Diego a few days ago to say, I don't know if I can come, I don't know if I have a voice. But I decided it was so important to come. So thank you, and I'm very honoured to be here at such an important symposium, particularly talking about inequities, which has really been the driver behind my work. But as life would have it, the other interesting thing about this morning is the Janusz Korczak aspect. And I do know about Janusz Korczak. I've known about him since I was about 10. And the reason why is, so both myself and my husband and my families are Holocaust survivors. And I grew up in Melbourne, which has got a very large Holocaust population, and went to a socialist youth group, and one of the heroes of that socialist youth group was Janusz Korczak. So I feel both moved and appropriate to be here this morning talking about inequities for children, and I think Elaine talked about it very rightly to say, how is it that we have our rich countries and have these terrible inequities for children? So what I'd like to talk to you about is this idea of inequity and where you live making a difference. But because I'm Australian and because in Australia we need your money, I'd like to try and sell Australia to you. You'd like to come and visit. This is the Opera House in Sydney. It's very lovely. This is Melbourne. Melbourne is kind of like Montreal, other than the fact they both start with M. It actually has a real feel like Montreal, so if you come, you'll feel at home. We have lots of lovely animals like kangaroos and koalas. So that's my little bit for Australia. But I wanted to start with this quote, and it is a quote from an Australian group of authors talking about, and I use it in all my talks because I think it brings us all onto the same page about what it is we want. And it talks about a society that is good to children is one with the smallest possible inequalities for children, with the vast majority of them having the same opportunities from birth for health, education, inclusion and participation. And that's really the starting point, right? That's really what we want. But this is kind of, I want to sort of turn a little bit of this stuff on its head and talk about this idea of equality. And this is where things get confusing because we talk about health inequalities and then we forget that the response to inequalities is not equal provision. And this is the problem that happens when you have equal provision. And I want to show you just a quick example of what this means in real life for children. This is the results of our EDI. It's called the Australian Early Development Census, but it's the same as your early development instrument. And I want to show you just quickly these lines here. This blue line here is the poorest children. This is the richest children, children who got preschool, children who didn't get preschool. And just a reminder, so preschool is good for everybody, but in Australia it doesn't close the gap. In other words, we haven't delivered on this. We haven't delivered on equity. We haven't delivered on the social justice aspects of this. We haven't given children according to what they need. And then the final bit of this, and this is what equity looks like, in Australia. These are our 2-year, this is one of the few slides I can show you where we have equity. These are our 2-year immunisation rates. And what you can see for all these different groups, these are Indigenous or Aboriginal children, and particularly here low and high SES, no differences. So when we do things equitably, we get equal outcomes. But sadly, this is reality. And this is where we are, at least in Australia, and I would hazard a guess in Canada as well. And this is what it looks like geographically, and that's what I want to focus on today. I want to talk about social disparities and how they translate geographically. These are our EDI results for Melbourne, and the darker the area, the worse the outcome. And you can see the differences. So this is one geographic area, and you can see how inequities in children's development plays out across that area. Here is another area you might recognise. This is Montreal. This is your EDI results. And once again, you can see how these differences in children's development play out across Montreal. So the geographic inequities are the challenge for us. And I want to talk about not only measuring it, but meeting the challenge. So I want to start with the idea of this ecology of childhood. You all know about this based on from Brenna's work. And I want to remind ourselves that where you live really does make a difference. So let's start here with this kind of societal level. This is a report that came out from the OECD last year talking about inequalities in rich countries, and we're one of those, and so are you. Here is Australia. It's kind of a third of the way down. It looks at income inequality, and income inequality in all our countries is getting worse. We're heading back to the 1930s in the range of income inequality. And looking at child poverty as well, same thing. So it's translating into poorer outcomes for kids. Here is the United Kingdom. I'm trying to represent all the countries in the room. United Kingdom actually are doing okay. Here is the US. The US do crap on everything, so that's kind of useful. But here is Canada. Also not so great. So where you live, right? Whether it's, we're going to talk about neighbourhoods, but which country you live in makes a difference for children. Now let's talk about this community level, because this is the level that we're talking about today, and this is what this wonderful report that came out, and I think it's fantastic that you got media, even if it sometimes doesn't get it completely right. It's wonderful to get media about these sorts of things. So I want to share with you two projects that we've been working on that have really challenged us. One is this one. It's called the Kids in Community Study, trying to look at exactly what Diego was talking about. What is it about where you live that makes a difference, and how do we measure it, and how do we do something about it? So we use the Australian Early Development Census, which, as I said, is exactly like your EDI, except we have it across the entire country. And we've had it across the entire country for 3 times, 2009, 2012 and 2015. So it tells us something about children's development at a very small area level. So that's very helpful for us. But what it showed us were these geographic inequities in children's development. And so we were very interested in trying to understand this idea about where you live making a difference, but there were these really interesting gems in there. These areas here, we've called them off-diagonal positive. Areas where it's poor, like we all went, oh yeah, poor areas, children do bad. Poor areas, children do bad. We kind of work with that. But what about the poor areas where children do well? What could we learn from those areas that tell us something about what we can do when you compare them to poor areas where children are doing as expected? And that's how we set up this project, to try and understand the gems, the areas where kids are doing better than expected. And to do that, we pushed ourselves because, you know, as I said, we often just talk about socioeconomic status. And in the same way that you've talked about other things in your report, we were very interested in these other community levers. And so we went back into the literature to try and understand what were the sort of environments that we could look at that might make a difference for children's development. And we arranged them here around the community, around this ecological, around the family, to say, what are these domains? This writing's a little bit small, so I've put it onto this separate table. So you can see we've talked about the physical or built environment, the social environment, yes, socioeconomics, because of course that's important, services and governance. And against them, there's all these things here that we want to measure. Because ultimately what we're really interested in are things we can change. So what are the things that are policy sensitive and modifiable? Because like here, we're seeing more and more communities really interested in making a difference. And we want to give them things that will really make a difference. Not that we think make a difference, but that really make a difference. And so we've set out to measure all those things. And I can tell you it seemed like a good idea at the time, but man, is it hard. So we've done it in 25 local communities, which come to about 12 bigger communities across Australia. This is what Australia looks like. It's about the size of Canada. There's only about 24 million people that live in it. They mostly live around here, and this is a big area of nothing. It's called the desert. Now, I'm not going to go into detail in this table, but I wanted to highlight the fact that we've used qualitative methods and quantitative methods. And I tell you that because often we get stuck with the data we already have, and it only tells part of the story, and I'm sure Tanina and Catherine are going to talk about the limitations of the data you only have. But the problem with that is it doesn't tell the full story. And for communities, it was really important for us to understand the full story. And so we use quite a lot of qualitative data as well as quantitative data to try and understand the story. And if any of you are qualitative researchers, you're going to really be wowed by the amount of data we have. Too much data, really. We have 50 focus groups with parents and stakeholders. We have data from 136 interviews. And if you know anything about qualitative data, you'll know that is a lot of transcribing. And we also have policy documents that we're analysing. And it's been really important because if we didn't ask the people who live there and work there why they think their communities are doing better than other communities, we don't know the answers because the data just doesn't tell us those answers. So some very preliminary findings I wanted to share with you. First of all, in this social area, I'm not going to go through the detail of all this because we haven't got time. But what was really interesting in the areas that were doing better, two things. Really weird things. First of all, the areas that were doing better had a sense of stigma. So they felt, I don't know how stigma translates into French. I'm hoping the interpreter does. The second thing is that they had a sense of community. So the stigma actually gave them a sense of community. These were areas that were doing better. The second thing is what's emerging is the importance of the built environment, particularly the quality of the facilities and parks. And lots of parents and stakeholders were talking about this. And, the beauty about this is you can do something about parks and facilities. And then we looked at quantitative data, and lots of quantitative data. We did a survey of 1,000 people in each of these 25 communities with a really terrible response rate. So don't go and do community surveys. It doesn't work. But I wanted to talk to you briefly about the use of geographic information systems. This is our ability to layer information and start to tell us something about the relationships between the built environment and child development outcomes. Now, the beauty about the built environment is, once again, there's stuff we can do, stuff that policymakers might want to make a difference to, stuff that foundations, philanthropists might want to make a difference to, that will make a difference for children. And when we looked at all our quantitative data, what was interesting is the thing that emerged quantitatively with our research is, once again, here in this physical domain, the availability of parks and the availability of local family destinations and traffic exposure. So this is like way out, right? This is not about services. Actually, services didn't come up at all. It's all these other things. And in the breaks, I'm happy to talk to you about some of these really interesting stories that have emerged about this connection between the built environment and the social environment and how that brings different people into areas. Remembering that we looked at poor areas, these two areas were both poor. Wasn't one was middle class. They were both poor, but one area was doing much better. And so it's really exciting for us to think about there might be things we can do. And I just wanted to put this up because I want to acknowledge all of my project team. And this is a national multidisciplinary team. And just from a research point of view, there is no possible way one single profession can work out how to work in these areas. It has to be multidisciplinary. And the second thing is, I put all of this up for two reasons. First of all, we have Canadian partners, so that's kind of cool. And then the second thing is, we have government and non-government people at the table because, once again, I don't want to do this as a researcher off in my lovely ivory tower. I want to work with my end users because in the end, they're going to make the difference. But I want to go a little bit deeper now. I want to talk about services because fundamentally, many of you in this room are service providers. And I want to get down to this next level, the child and family, because what it is, where you live makes a difference, but it makes a difference for children. And I want to talk about, finally, this other little project that we have. And it's a little project that came about because I've become old, grumpy and impatient. And the problem with that is you kind of just want things to start happening. And what I realised was that we needed to do much more with what we already have. It wasn't good enough to say we need more. It was much better to say we need different. And so we came up with this idea of restacking the odds, which works on James Heckman's work, which is this mutually reinforcing activities. So James Heckman was an economist. And it's this idea that what about if we could deliver what we already deliver with an equity lens? Like, what if we could deliver it really well to the poorest areas? And what if we could deliver our antenatal care and our early childhood education and care and the first 3 years of school? This is probably the biggest public health intervention we have. What if we could deliver them really well? And what if we could deliver targeted sustained nurse home visiting, because there's some pretty good evidence for that? And what if we could deliver parenting programs, because there's some good evidence for that? And what if we could do that really well? Now, in our country, these 5 things exist in almost every community. They're not new and new beaut, not brilliantly, but they all exist. And then what if we could deliver them to the quantity, quality, and participation that they're meant to be? We have a high tolerance for mediocrity in Australia. There's some, so that must be okay. That mediocrity is leading to increasing inequalities. And if we want inequity to be addressed, we have to reverse that, and we have to use what we have, and we have to shine an equity lens on the services we already deliver. And so this is how life would look once we do all of this. You get a heat map to get a sense of, hey, is it a problem with quantity? Well, that's an interesting policy lever. Or is it quality? Well, actually, that's a different policy lever. Or is it participation? Well, that's often a local policy lever. So how do you arm communities with the information they need to really make a difference? Because where you live makes a difference for children. So what information do you need as a community to really make a difference for children? And how do we shift this high tolerance for mediocrity out of people's minds and say, hey, actually, for all those children that you're in this room are all really passionate about, we need to think about how do we make the system work for them, because the moment it works against them. So I want to end with 2 slides. This is the first one. This is the one about how we all feel, and it's like going to be Friday afternoon soon, and this is definitely how we will feel. But I wanted to really remind us about why we're here. And so I'm going to finish in less than 5 minutes. I could have talked for ages. So this is from Gabriela Mistral. She's a South American poet. She's a Nobel Prize winning poet. And she says, many things we need can wait. The child cannot. Now is the time his bones are being formed. His blood is being made. His mind is being developed. To him we cannot say tomorrow. His name is today. Thank you very much.